All right, so I wasn't planning on taking the troubleshooting or the electrical issue too much farther than what I did in the previous video, but I'm interested in it and I like to troubleshoot. So I did a little bit more digging today and I feel like I might be onto something now. So when I unplugged everything, and I said in the previous video that I had unplugged everything for the harness, I didn't unplug the alternator. I thought I did because I was messing with it earlier off camera and I was unplugging it. So I thought I had that unplugged with everything else. I didn't have the alternator unplugged. And a couple of you guys in the comments mentioned alternator causing similar problems. So I became interested in that theory and then looked at the alternator. I did just change this alternator. So I put this alternator on before I went to the dyno like a week ago because I was out testing the car and the alternator wasn't charging. So I had this alternator on before and it completely wasn't charging and the car actually died when I was out driving because the car dropped to like 9 volts. This is the one I put on when I tested it that day and I came home, put the new alternator on, then everything was fine. So what I want to show you guys, if you remember that little buzzing noise that was happening and it was making the fan kind of run and make that little buzz sound. So listen here. Hopefully I can get this to pick up on the camera. So I'm going to plug the alternator plug into the alternator. Can you hear that? Hopefully you guys can hear that on the camera. So then when I, basically how I found it was I unplugged this with the ignition on and it stopped making that noise. And that is what was causing like the voltage to drop and the weird voltage situation that was happening. So now when I go back to this alternator, it doesn't do it at all. So my initial thought would be bad alternator, right? Like something's bad with this. But this one I took off because I thought it was bad because it wasn't charging. So I looked at the data logs. This wasn't giving any voltage. This one was giving voltage. This one was charging. We verified with the multimeter and everything while it was running. So what I want to do is to verify the alternator issue or verify it being like ECU charging issue or like different wiring. I don't know if I don't really think it's a wiring issue, to be honest, because it's been like kind of push button start. Hasn't been a problem for like 6 or 7 months since I wired it all up. Not that I've been driving it a lot, but something definitely changed because it's been fine. All right, so sometimes these videos are hard to make because you're admitting your mistakes. And when you make mistakes that you shouldn't make, it's a little bit hard to swallow sometimes. So we had a lot of discussion and I was troubleshooting it. Was thinking bad alternator, confirmed a bad alternator. This one seemed like it was starting to go bad. I was having voltage spiking issues. The car was bucking and surging when it was running. And then all of a sudden one day it just clicked, didn't want to start. So it was push button start pretty much for like 6 months where I never had an issue with it starting it or driving it, whatever. And then all of a sudden this issue just happened. So it seemed like it was a bad ground, and we were talking about that kind of in the comments on the last video, that it was acting like a bad ground, and when I jumped it with the other jumper cable, grounded it, it seemed like it wanted to start. So started going over grounds today, checked the alternator, and now after I fixed this other thing, this alternator's not doing that buzzing noise. It's not making the fan buzz anymore, which that an alternator might not be bad. That one is bad, but it probably went bad because of this issue that I had, which I'll show you in a bit. So I went through all the grounds, sanded off everything. I thought maybe like fluid got underneath. Like I was desperate for ground issues here. So dug through everything, went through every single ground, and still did the same thing. So I went extremely all the way back to basics to when I bought the terminals for the battery. These battery terminals have powder coat on them. And they have a little section in the middle that is cleaned off of the powder coat for the wire to go in. It's like just supposed to have one wire coming out of it. like in the center, but it's powder coated around the outer edge rings here, and I never scraped that powder coating off. So these wires were just like on top of powder coat. It's so obvious that it never should have happened, so it's kind of disappointing that it even got that far. And it's one of those things that's tough, that like it's not something that you feel like checking because it's so obvious that you shouldn't have to check it. So all the way back to basics, checked it, and that was it. So we'll check it out. So no ground break issue. And I can tell kind of, it seems like it's running a little bit differently. It fires pretty quick. The starter cranks over a lot faster. Kind of obvious stuff. So I think before I pull the transmission out of it, I want to go drive it. So when I first started tuning this thing with the micro squirt, there was a lot of comments about how my VE numbers were high, and they were pretty high. They were about double what they should normally be. So what I ended up doing was adjusting the required fuel in the tune to get the VE numbers back to kind of normal where they should be. So now I'm curious if that was the reason for my VE numbers being high, which would make sense if there was a bad connection, bad electrical connection, bad ground, that it wouldn't be getting proper voltage, and I would have to increase my fueling to get proper fueling because the injectors aren't opening the right way and ECU's not seeing power properly. That could explain the voltage spiking, why it was kind of all over the place. I think I'm going to go drive it tomorrow and just do some data logs and see where it's at, and depending how messed up it is, maybe go back to the dyno and see what it was doing, because we were having trouble with the computer and like pulling fuel out of it. So I'm wondering if that was contributing to that, and why it seemed like it was down on power and we couldn't adjust the computer and couldn't get fuel out of it. So I wonder if that was just my issue the whole time. I'm recording this after I edited the video that you just saw. So after the explanation and rewatching it, I wasn't completely satisfied with the explanation and understanding it. So I came back out here. I started thinking about it a little bit more because it was running for a long time. That's why I said I feel like something changed, and I was trying to figure out in my head what changed. It was running for like 6 months where I could come out and just start it and it was okay. So, but I did remember the other day when I was driving it and it died, that this whole terminal was loose. And at that time, this wire here, which is for, it's a ground for my transcooler fan relay, or fan, what I did was I had it kind of temporarily wired and then just jammed underneath the post, like the terminal between the post. And I just had it in there and then kind of wedged it down, shimmied it, and then tightened it a little bit. So that had loosened up, and then I went to finalize this wiring, and here's where my thought is on the change. So when I did this and I clamped this thing under here, I loosened these up to lift this little tab up enough to get that wire underneath there. So what I'm thinking happened is, originally when it was starting and running, and I'll show you guys a picture of the post before I remove this. So you can see in the powder coating that there's some spots around where the rings here are like clearly embedded into the powder coating, like pushing almost through the powder coating. So that's probably where I had the connection. And then when I came back to add this wire, I like slightly loosened this up, slid that wire in, tightened it back down, but these lugs probably shifted a little bit to where it was over the top of fresh powder coating and it didn't have that connection anymore. And that is where the no start issue came from, because it was set up the same way. The only real difference was this wire was in between the post and the terminal before, and I moved it over to here, and then like a few days later came out to try to move the car and it didn't start. I'm like, well, what the hell? So now after watching the whole video and editing it and thinking about this a little bit more, I'm pretty sure that's what happened. So just wanted to add that, and I think that's my final answer.